Hey, so you know that you don't want to miss any episodes of 10 Minute Murder. And you want them the moment they're released. The best way to make that happen is to follow in whatever app you're listening right now. Depending on the app, it might say follow or subscribe or collect. Just hit that button and be the first to get new episodes.
10 Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10 Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10 Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. My name is Joe. I'm the host, and thank you for being here. As I mentioned last episode, I'm adding a new thing to this podcast, a whole episode where I talk only about the cases that you send me that you want me to talk about. The catch is, I'm not going to go through and fully research them. You need to include all the information, and I'll read your email on the podcast. I'll look it up to make sure you're sending me a legitimate story, and I'm not reading a case about the murder of Amanda Hug and Kiss or Bend Over. Although hearing about Hugh Jazz might be interesting. Anyway, tell me the story in an email with all the pertinent information, include your name at the end, and I'll read it here on an episode. Doesn't matter how long it is, so don't worry about that part. I get so many story submissions that I thought this would be a cool way to get as many of them in as I can. And I'll still do the main podcast episodes, obviously, where I do my own episodes. But if you'd like to submit one, you can email that to 10minutemurder@gmail.com. I'll put it in the show notes just in case you forget, but it's the number 10minutemurder@gmail.com. The story today is one that I normally try to avoid. I stick to cases that happen within our lifetime, or if it's really interesting, within our parents' lifetime. The murderer you're going to hear about was killing and eating people well before anyone we know was alive. Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was a cannibal, child rapist, and serial killer. He lived during the late 1800s and early 1900s and was known as Moon Maniac, the Boogeyman, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19, 1870. His father was American of English ancestry, and his mother was Scots-Irish American. His father was 43 years older than his mother, and 75 years old at the time of his birth. Fish was the youngest child and had 3 siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin. He wished to be known as Albert after a dead sibling, and to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs, which he was given at an orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania, one of his brothers was confined to a state mental hospital, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illness, and his mother had oral and/or visual hallucinations. Oral meaning hearing, like she was probably hearing voices. Keep in mind that this wasn't too far removed from a time when doctors would come to your house and tell you that you had ghosts in your blood and you should do cocaine about it. Albert's father died in 1875 of a heart attack, mostly because he was old AF, and living to 80 even today is pretty good. After he died, Ham and Eggs was put into an orphanage by his mother. He later talked about the orphanage, saying, "I was there till nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." He was frequently abused in the orphanage and said that he began to enjoy the beatings. We all know I'm anti-kink shaming. That's well established, but he's a child, so this is not really okay. By 1880, Fish's mother had a government job and was able to remove Fish from the orphanage. In 1882, at age 12, he began a homosexual relationship with a telegraph boy. That boy introduced Fish to things like urolagnia, which is drinking urine, and coprophagia, which is eating excrement. I'm not one to talk, but also I am one to talk, and by this time, at just 12 years old, after the loving to be beaten and drinking pee sitch, there should have been a whole parade of red flags. Fish began visiting public baths, where he could just sit and vibe, watching other boys undress, and he spent a lot of his weekends on those visits. Throughout his life, he would write obscene letters to women whose names he acquired from classified advertising and matrimonial agencies. It's the modern-day equivalent to Snapchatting penis pictures to women he'd meet on Tinder. By 1890, Fish moved to New York City. He said at this point in his life he was a prostitute and was raping young boys regularly. 8 years later, his mother arranged a marriage for him with Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 9 years younger. They would have 6 children: Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. He worked as a house painter and continued molesting children, mostly boys younger than age 6. He later talked about an incident where one of his of-age sex partners took him to a wax museum. Albert saw a bisection of a penis. After that, he became obsessed with sexual mutilation. Around 1910, Fish met a 19-year-old intellectually disabled man named Thomas Kedden. He took Kedden to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. It's not known if Fish forced him to do these things or not. After 10 days, Fish took Kedden to an old farmhouse and tortured him for 2 weeks. He eventually cut half his penis off, saying, "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me." He originally intended to kill Kedden, cut up his body, and take it home, but feared that the hot weather would draw attention to him. Instead, he poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill, and kissed Kedden goodbye, and he bounced. In 1917, his wife, for some reason, up and left him for another man. That man happened to be the handyman that was living with the Fish family. They took nearly everything from the house of value, but they left the kids behind for Albert to raise. At this point, like his mother, he began to hear voices. He believed that he was getting instructions from John the Apostle. Fish started sticking needles into his groin and stomach. He was later found to have at least 29 needles around his pelvic area that he stuck all the way in there and left them to stay. He also frequently smacked himself with a nail-studded paddle, and once inserted wool, dripping with lighter fluid, into his rectum and set it on fire. One semi-positive note to mention: Fish never physically attacked or abused his children, although he did encourage them and their friends to use that paddle on him, which is completely vile. Around this time, he began to wonder about cannibalism. He dipped his toes into that water by eating raw animal meat. He'd sometimes serve that to his children for dinner as well. By 1919, his depravity really ramped up. He preyed on mentally handicapped people or African Americans because he said these people would not be missed. He believed now that God was telling him to torture and sexually mutilate children. He had what he called his implements of hell: a meat cleaver, butcher knife, and handsaw. In May of 1928, 58-year-old Albert Fish saw a newspaper ad by Edward Budd looking for work. He arranged to visit the Budd family and was using it to scope out his plan to eventually murder him. When he returned for a second visit, his plan changed when he was introduced to Edward's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace. Fish lied to the family and said he had to attend his niece's birthday party and requested that Grace come with him. She left with Fish, but never returned. Strangely, another man was arrested for her disappearance. He was tried and found not guilty. In 1934, Fish wrote the Budd family an anonymous letter, detailing how he was the one that took Grace. He described how he choked her to death, cut her into small pieces, and spent the next 9 days eating her sweet and tender body. Those are his words, not mine. Fish made sure to mention at the end that she remained a virgin. Police used that letter to track down Fish. It was written on very specific stationery. He was arrested and did not deny the murder once in custody. He told them he didn't rape her, but did have 2 involuntary ejaculations while he was strangling her to death. Also, while in custody, Albert Fish confessed to killing 9-year-old Frances McDonnell. In July 1924, the body was found hanging in a tree by his suspenders after being sexually assaulted and some flesh stripped off. Fish said later that he intended to castrate the boy, but heard people nearby, so he left. In February of 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney and his 3-year-old neighbor were playing together in their apartment hallway. They disappeared. Later, the 3-year-old was found on the roof and said the boogeyman took Billy. Fish confessed in a letter to his attorney how he tortured and drank the little boy's blood. He took pieces of him home, including what he called his monkey and peewees, and cooked them with vegetables and bacon. He ate that for the next 4 days, but said he couldn't eat his peewees because they were too tough to chew. He flushed them in the toilet. Albert Fish's trial lasted 10 days. He pled insanity, claiming to hear voices, and associated his cannibalism as communion. It was determined that he was abnormal but sane. One witness claimed that such a person was not mentally sick, and that these were common perversions that were, quote, socially perfectly all right, and that Fish was no different from millions of other people. Some very prominent and successful people who suffered from the very same perversions. I really hope not. None of the jurors doubted that Fish was insane, but ultimately, as one later explained, they felt he should be convicted and executed anyway. Hamilton Howard Ham and Eggs Albert Fish was executed on January 16, 1936, in the electric chair at Sing Sing. He entered the chamber at 11:06 p.m. and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. Fish is said to have helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body. His last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." Before he died, he wrote a final statement and gave it to his lawyer. His lawyer refused to reveal what was written on those 3 pages, saying, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I've ever read." That's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. Hey, thanks for listening today, and don't forget what I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. If you'd like for me to read your submitted story on this podcast, you can email it to 10minutemurder@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you are listening right now, and you'll never miss another episode. And if you have friends that are into brief true crime stories like this, tell them about 10-Minute Murder. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.